There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over the Nevada desert right around 2 in the morning. It is not a peaceful silence, but rather a heavy, suffocating blanket that presses against the glass of the convenience store doors. Vance used to think the isolation was a comfort, a welcome break from the noise of the city he left behind. He liked the slow, unhurried rhythm of sweeping the dusty linoleum floor while the old fluorescent lights hummed above. He believed that being completely alone meant he was safe from the unpredictable nature of other people. That illusion shatters completely once you realize you are not actually the only thing out there in the dark. The job at the station off Route 50 came with a modest paycheck and a single stained sheet of notebook paper. That crumpled piece of paper was taped securely to the inside of the bulletproof cashier booth. It held a list of very specific instructions that made absolutely no logical sense to a normal person. When Vance first read them, he chuckled, assuming it was just a twisted joke meant to haze the new night shift guy. You never really understand the gravity of arbitrary rules until ignoring one nearly costs you your life. Tonight, we are going to look out the window with him, and I need you to listen very closely to what happens next. Vance had been driving aimlessly across the country when his old sedan finally gave up near the rusted pumps. With barely enough cash in his wallet to buy a sandwich, he was desperate for any kind of work. The station was a relic from a forgotten era, boasting faded red paint and a single flickering neon sign that buzzed like an angry wasp. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked with stale chips, warm soda, and rows of dusty motor oil. It felt less like a functional business and more like a solitary outpost sitting at the edge of the known world. For a guy who just wanted to fade into the background, it seemed like the perfect place to hide out and save some money. The rhythm of the work was incredibly slow, defined by long stretches of absolute stillness and solitary routines. He would spend hours meticulously rearranging the candy bars or wiping down the smudged glass of the beverage coolers. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of his worn-out sneakers and the low rumble of the ice machine turning over. Outside, the vast expanse of the desert stretched out for miles in every direction, completely swallowed by the starless night. Sometimes the wind would pick up, throwing fine grains of sand against the windows with a soft, rhythmic scratching noise. He found a strange kind of comfort in those repetitive sounds, letting them lull him into a state of relaxed complacency. The previous evening, the manager had handed over the keys with an unusually grim expression on his weathered face. Orson was a quiet, deeply wrinkled man who always smelled faintly of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. He never stayed a minute past sundown, always rushing to his battered truck as if outrunning a ticking clock. Before leaving, he tapped a thick, calloused finger against the paper taped to the glass of the security booth. He told Vance, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, to read it carefully and never cut corners. Then, without waiting for a reply or offering a goodbye, Orson locked the heavy door and drove away entirely too fast. Left entirely to his own devices, Vance settled into the squeaky leather chair and finally examined the handwritten note. The ink was faded, written in an erratic, shaky cursive that was difficult to decipher under the harsh overhead glare. The first item instructed him to lock the public restrooms exactly at midnight, regardless of who was begging to use them. Another bullet point warned him to completely ignore the sound of crying if it came from the direction of the old tire display. The final rule stated that if a pristine yellow taxi pulled up to pump number 4, he must hide under the counter and close his eyes. Vance simply rolled his eyes, took a long sip of his cold coffee, and dismissed the entire list as a pathetic attempt to scare the new kid. He assumed Orson was just another eccentric local with too much time on his hands and a weird sense of humor. Around 3 in the morning, the heavy silence of the isolated desert began to shift in a way that felt entirely wrong. It was not a sudden noise, but rather a bizarre absence of the usual ambient sounds that filled the station. The low, constant hum of the fluorescent lights abruptly cut out, leaving behind a thick, ringing pressure in Vance's ears. Even the wind outside seemed to die instantly, as if the entire landscape had been vacuum-sealed inside a glass jar. A profound heaviness settled into the room, making it difficult for him to pull air into his lungs. He stood up from his chair, his movements inexplicably sluggish, and walked slowly toward the front windows to peer out. Out in the vast emptiness of the pitch-black lot, a single pair of headlights finally cut through the heavy dark. The vehicle approached without making a single sound, the tires rolling over the loose gravel in complete, unnatural silence. As it glided under the harsh white canopy of the station, the details of the car slowly became clear. It was a pristine, bright yellow taxicab, looking completely out of place hundreds of miles from any major city. It bypassed the first three open pumps and rolled to a smooth, noiseless stop directly in front of pump number 4. Vance felt his stomach drop instantly as he remembered the final line written on Orson's crumpled piece of paper. The driver's side door slowly clicked open, and the true nightmare of the graveyard shift finally began. The driver's side door swung wide open, but the interior dome light of the cab remained completely dead. A tall, unnaturally thin figure stepped out onto the concrete island, its limbs moving in a jerky, disjointed rhythm. It was wearing a faded gray suit that hung off its skeletal frame as if draped over a wooden coat rack. Vance squinted through the smudged glass, trying to make out a face, but the space beneath the fedora was just a smooth, featureless blur. Instantly, the digital cash register on the counter sparked and began spitting out a continuous stream of blank receipt paper. The security monitors above the door flickered wildly, displaying a wall of static before shifting to an impossible top-down view of Vance staring out the window. The sheer absurdity of the situation paralyzed him, rooting his worn sneakers firmly to the dusty linoleum floor. The tall figure did not walk toward the pumps, but instead turned its blank face directly toward the brightly lit store. It began to glide forward, its leather shoes never actually making contact with the ground, hovering just an inch above the pavement. Vance felt a sudden, crushing weight press down on his chest, as if gravity inside the booth had suddenly tripled. He tried to take a step back, but his leg muscles simply refused to respond to his brain's frantic commands. The thing reached the double-glass doors, pressing two unnaturally long, pale hands against the thick, reinforced pane. A sickening, wet, squelching sound vibrated through the glass, echoing loudly in the otherwise completely silent room. Orson's written warning screamed in Vance's mind, urging him to drop to the floor, but the sheer terror held him entirely captive. The creature slowly tilted its head to the side, maintaining its faceless gaze on the trembling cashier. Vance frantically slammed his hand onto the red panic button under the desk, praying for the shrill wail of the security alarm. Instead of a siren, the overhead speakers crackled to life and began playing a distorted, slowed-down recording of Vance's own breathing. The rhythmic, amplified sound of his terrified gasps filled the store, making the cramped space feel incredibly claustrophobic and deeply wrong. The figure at the door began to tap a single, elongated fingernail against the glass in perfect time with the recorded breaths. Every single tap sent a violent tremor through the floorboards, rattling the shelves and knocking heavy cans of motor oil to the ground. The thin barrier between the safe, mundane interior and the impossible nightmare outside was rapidly beginning to fail. Desperation finally broke through his physical paralysis, and Vance threw himself violently backward out of the squeaky leather chair. He crashed hard onto the grimy tiles behind the counter, scraping his elbows, but he barely registered the sharp pain. He curled his body into a tight ball, pressing his back against the cold metal of the locked cigarette cabinet. Remembering the final, crucial part of the instruction on that crumpled paper, he squeezed his eyes shut as tightly as humanly possible. You must never, under any circumstances, look at them once they manage to cross the threshold of the building. The heavy deadbolt on the front doors slid open with a loud metallic clack that echoed like a gunshot in his ringing ears. A sudden rush of air entered the room, but it was not the cool desert breeze. It smelled violently of ozone and burning copper. Heavy, dragging footsteps began to pace slowly down the center aisle, moving past the racks of cheap sunglasses and stale pastries. The sound was completely wrong, squishing softly against the tiles as if the floor was covered in a thick layer of wet mud. Vance clamped his hands securely over his ears, but the strange, suffocating pressure in the room made the noise resonate directly inside his skull. The footsteps stopped right in front of the counter, lingering just inches away from where he lay curled in the dark. A low, vibrating hum began to radiate from the other side of the cheap wood, making Vance's teeth rattle violently in his jaw. He knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that the thing was leaning over the counter, patiently waiting for him to open his eyes. I need to pause for a second because some of you driving out there tonight might actually end up on Route 50. If you ever take a wrong turn and find yourself pulling up to a faded red station with a buzzing neon sign, you are already in danger. Do not step out of your vehicle, do not look at the rusty pumps, and absolutely do not look through the store windows. I have managed to acquire the complete, uncensored list of Orson's rules, and you need to memorize them immediately. Look down at your screen right now and open the pinned comment at the very top of the comment section below. Read those survival instructions carefully. Screenshot them if you have to, because knowing them is the only way you leave that stretch of highway alive. Now, turn your eyes back to the dark road, because Vance is about to learn what happens when you follow a rule entirely too late. The vibrating hum radiating from the wooden counter grew loud enough to rattle the loose change scattered on the floor tiles. Vance kept his eyelids squeezed shut so tightly that bursts of white light exploded across his dark field of vision. He could feel a terrible, freezing dampness slowly creeping over the edge of the desk, pooling down toward his cramped legs. Whatever was standing just inches away from him let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded exactly like a deflating tire. The overhead security radio suddenly crackled, broadcasting a garbled string of numbers in a voice that sounded disturbingly like his own mother. Orson's warning screamed in his memory, demanding that he remain completely silent and completely blind until the yellow taxi finally drove away. Waiting patiently for the thing to leave was no longer an option, as the heavy, wet pressure began to crush his chest. Vance started to crawl backward on his hands and knees, dragging his body blindly across the sticky linoleum floor. He kept his eyes securely clamped shut, relying entirely on his memory of the cramped store layout to navigate the space. His fingers brushed against the familiar cold metal of the ice machine, giving him a desperately needed anchor point in the darkness. The squishing footsteps immediately followed him, matching his frantic pace with a slow, deliberate mockery of his terrified movements. He just needed to reach the heavy steel door of the inventory room and slide the deadbolt firmly into place. Every time his knee hit the floor, the ambient gravity seemed to shift, pulling him sharply to the left like a tilted ship. The harsh fluorescent lights above must have flickered back on, because a sickening, strobe-like red glare bled through his tightly closed eyelids. The air around him suddenly thickened into a dense, suffocating fog that tasted strongly of rust and burnt plastic. He threw his hand out wildly, and his knuckles finally slammed against the solid, reassuring frame of the backroom door. Grasping the round brass handle with slick, sweaty fingers, he twisted it hard and shoved his weight against the heavy steel. The door flew open, sending him tumbling violently into the pitch-black storage area surrounded by towering boxes of stale snacks. Vance kicked the door shut with the heel of his shoe and frantically slapped the heavy deadbolt into its locked position. Only then did he dare to open his eyes, finding himself in the absolute, crushing darkness of the windowless inventory room. He pressed his ear against the cold metal, listening for any sign that the tall, faceless figure was trying to break through. Instead of banging, a soft, rhythmic scratching started near the bottom hinge, like a large dog desperately trying to dig its way inside. The crumpled piece of paper had mentioned the back room in passing, stating that if you retreat there, you must turn on the emergency radio. Crawling blindly through the labyrinth of cardboard boxes, his trembling hands desperately searched for the small, battery-powered device on the manager's desk. His fingers finally grazed the plastic antenna, and he quickly snapped the power dial all the way to the maximum volume. A deafening burst of white static filled the small room, drowning out the wet scratching noise coming from the locked steel door. He sat down heavily on the concrete floor, pulling his knees tightly against his chest while the static washed over him. The thick, unnatural pressure in the air slowly began to recede, pushed back by the harsh wall of abrasive electronic noise. He sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, afraid to even take a deep breath over the loud hiss of the speaker. The survival rules did not explain why the noise worked, but right now, that cheap radio was his only shield against the unknown. Eventually, the harsh static on the radio began to break apart. occasionally interrupted by the faint sound of a passing semi-truck outside. Vance realized the deep, impossible silence that had smothered the gas station earlier was finally beginning to lift. He kept his eyes locked on the faint sliver of yellow light bleeding from under the heavy metal door, waiting for a shadow to cross it. No shadow ever appeared, and the sickening smell of burnt copper slowly faded back into the familiar scent of old cardboard. He knew the sun would be coming up soon, bringing the morning shift and a brief, temporary reprieve from the absolute madness. But until the heavy deadbolt on the front entrance clicked open from the outside, he was not moving a single muscle. The harsh, white static of the emergency radio finally died out, replaced by the soft, familiar voice of a morning traffic reporter. A thin sliver of pale morning light crept beneath the heavy steel door, cutting sharply through the absolute darkness of the inventory room. Vance sat shivering on the concrete floor, his clothes completely soaked in cold, nervous sweat from the hours spent curled into a defensive ball. Outside, the distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling over loose gravel signaled the arrival of a vehicle that sounded entirely normal. A rusty truck door slammed shut with a loud, metallic clanking noise that finally broke the oppressive spell holding the gas station hostage. He heard the familiar rattle of keys turning in the front entrance, followed by the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding open. Forcing his cramped legs to support his weight, Vance slowly stood up and placed a trembling hand on the brass doorknob. He turned it slowly, wincing as the hinges squealed, and stepped back out into the main aisle of the convenience store. The harsh fluorescent lights were humming normally again, casting a dull yellow glow over a scene of absolute chaotic destruction. Racks of cheap sunglasses and potato chips were violently overturned, their contents scattered randomly across the sticky linoleum floor. Yet, there were no wet, muddy footprints, no smell of burnt copper, and absolutely no sign of the impossibly tall figure in the gray suit. The store simply looked like it had been trashed by a rowdy group of teenagers passing through the desert in the middle of the night. Orson was standing casually behind the counter, pouring himself a steaming cup of black coffee from the old glass pot. The older man did not look surprised by the wrecked aisles, nor did he seem alarmed by the terrified, pale expression frozen on Vance's face. He simply took a slow sip from his mug, his deeply wrinkled eyes scanning the ruined displays with a look of mild, bored annoyance. Without saying a single word about the absolute nightmare that had just occurred, Orson calmly pointed a calloused finger toward the digital clock on the wall. It was exactly 6 a.m, meaning the graveyard shift was officially over, and the station was open for regular daytime business. The veteran manager knew exactly what had happened, and his total indifference was somehow more chilling than the faceless thing in the yellow taxi. Vance did not bother asking for his paycheck, nor did he attempt to clean up the spilled motor oil pooling near the front doors. He practically threw himself out of the building, sprinting toward his battered sedan with a desperate, frantic energy that burned his lungs. Jamming the key into the ignition, he prayed to a god he rarely thought about that the old engine would actually turn over. The car sputtered wildly before roaring to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. He sped onto the empty highway, pushing the speedometer as far as it would go, desperate to put miles between himself and that cursed stretch of road. He did not look in the rearview mirror a single time, terrified that he might see a pristine yellow cab following silently behind him. He eventually made it back to a crowded city, surrounding himself with the constant, comforting noise of sirens, shouting neighbors, and heavy traffic. Physically, he managed to survive the graveyard shift, but the deep psychological damage from that isolated desert station followed him home like a shadow. He still cannot sleep in a completely dark room, insisting on keeping a loud television running continuously to fill the terrifying silence. Every time he hears the squeak of a wet shoe on a tile floor, his chest tightens, and he completely forgets how to breathe. He quit driving altogether, unable to handle the crippling panic attacks that strike whenever a yellow taxi pulls up next to him at a red light. The desert did not manage to kill his body, but it successfully carved out a massive piece of his sanity and kept it forever. That is the brutal reality of stumbling into places that quietly exist just outside the boundaries of our normal, rational world. If you ever find yourself desperate for cash and a quiet place to hide, be extremely careful about the job offers you accept off the highway. Some late night shifts are not just about sweeping floors and restocking shelves. They are about maintaining a fragile treaty with things we cannot understand. The rules left behind by the veteran workers are not jokes, pranks, or hazing rituals designed to mess with the new guy. They are literal survival manuals, written in blood and trauma, meant to keep you breathing until the sun finally comes back up. Do not ignore the warnings of those who have survived, because the dark out there is incredibly patient, and it is always hungry for someone careless.